and welcome to Continuals An Hour With, the program where we interview some of our favorite authors. Today's featured author is R. Virdi, whose book, The First Binding, is going to be a lead title from Tor in August of this year. Welcome, Ronnie.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're thrilled. Anyway, when did you first know that you wanted to be a writer?
God, it feels so long ago now. It was the summer before I started college. So I just turned 18, high school had ended, and I got really frustrated at another author, traditionally published, very successful in the fantasy genre, who had just released a new novel where characters had died that we'd all loved. It's not George R. R. Martin.
He makes that a style, not a.
Yeah. And my best friend and I were really frustrated, and we knew nothing about writing, of course. So we were like, you can't do that in a series. Like, that's not what a real writer would do. And we took it upon ourselves to try to write our own fantasy novel. And that summer, we just started. I had no clue what we were doing. Most god-awful thing ever. I believe the novel's banned by the Geneva Convention under like the whole you can't torture people to look at and read. But the second I started, it clicked like nothing else has ever clicked with me in my life. I never felt happier than anything else. It just felt right. And from that point, I knew I wanted to tell stories. And I just kept with it ever since then. It just continued to feel natural.
Cool. Was your family supportive of your goal?
No. Very traditional South Asian family. My options were doctor, lawyer, engineer, and bonus points if I managed all three. And my dad has actually made arguments of how to do that by being my own doctor and being the lawyer for my own medical practice and being an engineer in my spare time creating medical implements. He really wished I could have done all three at times. And I don't know where I would have found the extra time in the day to do all of them, but his argument is I would have made the time.
Sleep is for sissies. Is that the idea?
Apparently, yeah.
How did Jim Butcher contribute to your evolution as a writer?
Oh, wow. So a lot of it obviously is due with he's obviously one of my favorite writers. I mean, I can easily say his favorite writer, but I don't know if that's gauche and irks other writers, but he is. I definitely grew up reading him. The Dresden Files released 2000, so I had just turned 10. My best friend, who at that time was actually more heavily a reader than me, had started the series, and he'd been like sort of trying to get me into it. And I was a little resistant at first because the way it was being pitched wasn't connecting with me. And then someone at a bookstore pitched it more for the mystery noir angle, which I had loved because my mother raised me on a lot of mystery novels and things of that nature. And I finally picked it up and I just fell in love with it. So when I finally did start writing urban fantasy, a lot of what I've been taught for natural pacing and techniques were from Jim. And then I've also put this in the first binding in the dedication that Jim actually saved my life when I was 21 because I struggled with depression and I'd gotten to a point where I wanted to cut my life short. It's the most tactful way to say it. And at a signing, I told Jim this, and he stopped in the middle of the signing and gave me a very personal, encouraging talk about where I could have gone with my career if I had stuck to it. And he told me that one day I could be where he was at. Maybe I'd panel with him one day. Maybe I'd be signing books next to him. Maybe I'd be in an anthology with him, be up for awards with him, and so many other things. And many of those have all happened. I've been up for awards with him in the same category. I've been in a few anthologies with him now, including Heroic Hearts this year, which debuted on the USA Today bestseller list. He's blurred my books. So many of the things he told me that could happen have happened.
So great. That's wonderful. You mentioned one of your early efforts, novel writing. So I assume there were more than one because we all do that. How many trunk novels had you finished before starting Gravesite, your first published novel?
God, let's see. I published Grave Beginnings in 2013 December. I think by then I'd written, and I had to finish all of them because I had finished a few. They were god awful though, but four full-length novels that were just terrible, and I wasn't happy with them. A few are actually serviceable when I go back and look at them. I wouldn't be happy with the prose where I'm at now, but in terms of structure, they were actually solid. I could see myself improving, but they weren't stories I wanted to tell and publish. They were, I think, me still trying to find the voice I really wanted to go with, and I settled with urban fantasy for Grave Beginnings and got that one out.
Mm-hmm. And basically that fed into not only your love of urban fantasy, but the fact that the noir, the mysteries. What were you reading, on in those in that terms? Because I have a theory about popular writers as to who they read in mysteries.
Um, well, mystery specifically, I grew up on the Robert Parker Spencer series.
Hmm.
Even before I read Dresden, and I later learned that was also an influence for Jim, which makes a lot of sense because again, my love for mystery as well as horror actually comes from my mother, who was a reader, but she didn't read traditional genre fiction like science fiction, fantasy. She read more like horror, mystery, detective novels, things of that nature. So I grew up with some of those, and I started reading them. And when I got into Dresden and earlier urban fantasy, I noticed the connection. And I went back to reading more of them as I was going forward. But at the time of publishing Great Beginnings, I was doing most heavily rereads of Dresden Files because I felt like that was the most natural voice that I resonated with, as well as obviously being so influential with me growing up. And part of the series was obviously a love letter to that. I have many references within the Grave Report, specifically to Jim Butcher's works, because of how influential both he and his works have been to me.
Hmm. Hmm. We discussed this a few years ago, but the Dresden Files isn't the only influence on the structure and the concept of of Gravesite and the Grave Report. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about, how you came to have the concept of for the Grave Report? Because it it also plays into your love of certain TV shows.
Yes. Uh, so flat out, it is definitely also a love letter and inspired by the old television show Quantum Leap, which was re-airing, I believe, on basic cable when I was a child, and it definitely left a mark on me. And when we were conceptualizing the series, my best friend and I were just talking back and forth, and he brought up Quantum Leap. I was like, "Oh God, yeah, that'd be awesome!" But we can't do the sci-fi element in urban fantasy, and I wouldn't want to. So we came up with more of like what is a more magical or numinous concept that works in urban fantasy. We went for the spiritual aspect of a soul. So Vincent, instead of like being someone's consciousness being beamed through technology into other people's bodies, is a disembodied soul waking up in the bodies of other people to solve whatever murdered them. And it was definitely that. And the other aspect that came up, which I don't believe we talked about, is the Grave Report was originally supposed to be a thriller, not urban fantasy, at least for the name. This urban fantasy would have had a different name at a different time, and that came from the TV show Burn Notice, which
Mhm.
is why in the Grey Report you eventually see Vincent has monologues talking about little tips and tricks he picks from other people, and that was inspired by Michael Weston's monologuing of different tricks he does throughout the series. But originally that title was going to go to a thriller series, and then the Grey Report I didn't have a name for, and I was like, well, this would just sound way better working with this urban fantasy and incorporating even the thriller aspects and the cool Michael Weston first person monologues about how you can use different pieces of tidbits to jerry rig cool tricks. And they all sort of folded up into this urban fantasy detective noir thriller that's also quantum leapy.
So, talking about you and your friend discussing conceptualizing. So, what came first, the characters and an idea of the plot or the concept? Do you start with a concept or do you start with characters or?
It actually differs from series to series. With the Grey Report specifically, I didn't have the character. I had an opening scene of him breaking his way out of the coffin, which is how the first book works, and escaping it. And at the time, I had seen someone. You know how there's oh god, they're not Discovery, but they're like similar in the channel. They do serial killer documentaries, but they also do things of like they'll bring in special forces soldiers to show you how to escape certain situations. And one of them was talking about how to use a broken watch to actually break his way out of a coffin, and it didn't seem feasible, but he showed how and talk about the damage your hand would sustain. But physically, most coffins are pretty cheaply made on the inside. Um, and he just talked his way out of that. And I'm like, that's such a cool scene. I'd like to do something like that. And we had the scene, and then we conceptualized the idea. And then from there, we were like, well, what kind of character would it take to do this? And there was another interview I watched at the time, and it was Jackie Chan describing how he created his persona as sort of being the lovable, comedic kung fu guy that everybody could beat up in a fight. And his argument from that came from he'd worked with Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee has established himself as such a force on screen that nobody beats Bruce Lee. He beats up everybody. And Jackie's thing was like, I can't be the dragon, so I'll be the guy that everybody can beat up in a fight, and it'll be funny and comedic. And I took the same approach to Dresden. I was like, Dresden's kind of this juggernaut, as silly as he can be. His enemies view him as someone terrifying, because at this point, by the time I started the Grey Report, I think Jim Butcher was already done with changes, and maybe he had just done Cold Days and Skin Game. So the series was well established, and Harry's a terrifyingly powerful character. And I was like, well, I'll do somebody who's like the opposite. Vincent Graves is kind of the punching bag. he can take all the abuse in the world and he keeps coming, but he's not necessarily physically threatening and overpowering. And we sort of started coalescing all these ideas and creating like the Jackie Chan to the Dresden Files. And that's what I ended up with, was him as a character. He gets more Deadpool analogs at times because of the way I've shaped him, his humor and his abilities. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Did TV also influence your second series, The Books of Winter?
No. I've gotten some questions about that because a lot of people notice one of the characters, Cassidy Winters, comes across as Kenzie from Lost Girl. And I have seen that show, and there might be some influences, but a lot of it actually came from an idea where I just reread at this time, Neverwhere, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And Neil Gaiman's The Books of Magic comics, which I absolutely loved. And I wanted to, the way sometimes ideas come to me is I have a concept I already love, and I go, what if I do that plus this? And I wanted to see if I could train myself to write a different style of first-person voice, because I've been writing the Great Report for a while. So it was like, could I do something that's like another love letter to Dresden Files, but also meets Gaiman's Neverwhere and the Books of Magic? Mm-hmm. And I just started fleshing that out, and that novel and series eventually evolved into becoming what it was with the first book, Dangerous Ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And how does lit RPG figure into this mix? Because I know you did some work in that genre or subgenre.
Yeah. At the time, I had a few friends who'd already like dabbled in the genre a year or two before it became extremely successful, and it was really lucrative. And I looked at it from the idea of a gamer and longtime anime fan. I was raised on RPG games more than any other, especially when I found my first love for the Elder Scrolls franchise with Morrowind. I played the other games, but I didn't really love Arena and Daggerfall. Morrowind was the one that sold me in the franchise, and I saw the potential there, but I didn't gravitate towards it naturally until other friends kept daring me and egging me on. They're like, your career's good, but it could be better places. Try writing the genre. Try. And after a while, I was like, okay, fine. I'll do it. And I started looking at games I liked, and at the time there was a zeitgeist of how the genre was being developed. There were certain ways to do it, and you shouldn't do it other ways. And I'm not one for rules, so the genre is very heavy on escapism, and I wanted to tackle other questions that the genre raised, things like Sword Art Online did about ethics and what happens to the human body, and what kind of world would it take where it's justifiable to upload kids into this dangerous VR world of video games. So I started looking at things like the 100, Logan's Run, and then video games like Dark Souls and Monster Hunter, which are not necessarily always bright, positive worlds. They're very harsh. And it just kind of like mashed together to create the first two books in that series. And they did really well. But I received mixed, like reception in the genre. Like a lot of people praise the craft and the story itself, but it was too dark for what people wanted in the genre. It's still more heavily focused on escapism and a little bit more brightness, and I went very too dark on it. And I think I needed a break after that for a while, which is how I ended up where I'm at now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And wasn't there a lot of math involved in it?
Yes, which is a weakness of mine. Fortunately, playing so many RPGs, I'm very familiar with their tables and systems. So what I did was just take existing tables and I changed the valuations and use numbers I was comfortable with. And then I had a friend who's smarter than me just track it all in Excel. They created, they use it for tax and accounting stuff. So they know all the formulas and stuff. And they created me a cheat sheet like, hey, if you enter this and you just plug in these numbers, it'll keep track for you. And I was like, oh, thank God. Okay. Thank you for making that for me. And I just had to plug and play the numbers and the formula.
Okay, I speaking as a writer and somebody who, not necessarily that math proficient, I could go into a store and tell you how much 13% off means, but beyond that, it gets kind of fuzzy. So I know there's math involved in it, but I can't seem to bring it in my head to how do you fit the math into the story without the math of, oh, wait, we have to throw this now because we've reached a crisis point and we need to know what the math is. How do you fit that into a story?
Well, what a lot of the genre does is they make it follow similar game mechanics to where after certain encounters and fights, climactic moments, you would just get experience. A lot of RPGs do this. Like for Dark Souls, for example, every time you kill an enemy, you instantly get souls, which are equivalent to experience from other games. It's more of a passive thing, and they justify it by pretty much just mimicking a lot of video game design. You'll have a passive background announcer or voice or display pop-up that they'll write into the story. confirming both the character and therefore the audience what just happened, whatever transaction it was, whether it's money spent or gained, experience, if you loot a body, what items, and they display them as pop-ups, usually using, like in Microsoft Word, not dialogue box, but I forgot, you can draw borders around certain text and stuff, and it gives it the image of like a pop-up box visually. There's still a lot of small visual tricks that writers will use to make it seem the same way as you might see it in a video game as a pop-up. I did not necessarily find it super enjoyable. I believe in times it breaks the narrative flow, but at the same time, that's sort of part of this genre inherently. So I think for this genre, it absolutely works. It's part of the promise you're set to receive. So here it's excusable. And then some other maybe fantasy novels, if someone would ever do that, I don't know. I think it'd be a mixed bag. I think some people who've read lit RPG and love it would easily adapt to it. I think it might throw some other readers off. I think it's just, it's one of those 50-50.
It sounds almost like the way footnotes work in Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell, because these little side notes that they are themselves a feature, not a bug,
Yes.
of the narrative. So yeah, did it influence you the way you approach fiction, or did it have any
Yes.
effect at all? Okay, how?
Believe it or not, because the first binding is a frame narrative and it's not told linearly. The first book, Goblin King, was where I first experimented with the past-present story. The beginning of the novel takes place way later, closer to a climactic scene, and the chapter ends with the character wondering, pretty much like the whole "how did I get here" moment, what went wrong, and then it's the entire past narrative story leading up to that point. And this is also the first novel where I actually felt comfortable experimenting with songs and music, because I've always had a love for it. And I've written poetry and dabbled with songwriting ever since I was a teenager, but I never included it in my novels until here. This is the first novels where I experimented with roving culture bands of like musicians, for example. So I had songs in there, and it felt very natural, and it was more fun to me than a lot of traditional lit RPGs that maybe don't make room for music and stuff, because some of my favorite video games have more than just the core story, and they have more than just the fighting and video game mechanics. They have smaller moments of ambiances and characters that add to the world and the culture in other ways. And I felt music would be a great tool for that. And it plays a much heavier role in the first binding. So getting the confidence to do it there with lit RPG first made me feel a lot better about including way more music, expanding on that kind of stuff in the first binding in the Tales of Tremaine series.
Oh, cool. Around the time of our last conversation, you'd been nominated for a Nebula for Messengers, the military science fiction novelette you wrote. That was a collaboration with someone from Sri Lanka.
Yep.
How the heck did that come about?
So the author, Yudhanjaya Wijaratne, is like a brother to me now. We had first met in a Facebook group for indie authors around 2016, I believe, at the end of the year. We weren't friends yet, but we were talking back and forth. And I believe he was writing a small craft book, because we're both craft monkeys. We absolutely love the craft of writing. And he was compiling just a small history of different structures throughout the history of writing, everything back down to Freytag's pyramid, the three-act structure, and so on. And he was looking for people to look it over and just, give like a thumbs up or whatever to it. And at that point, I had just been nominated for the first Dragon Award. So I was like, yeah, sure, buddy. I'll look it over. This sounds very cool. It's interesting to me. We added each other. He sent me a free copy, and I was like, hey, this is a great thing. And we started talking. And then one day we were both discussing Pacific Rim, which we both had a love for. And he was showing off cyberpunk art that had an Asian flair to it. And we're like, oh God, how cool would it be to do like a cyberpunk or sci-fi take of South Asian culture, and something as a nod to Pacific Rim and fix what was wrong with it, because he's a data scientist who's done a lot of work, including with work with the United Nations. And at that point, he brought up the argument that he didn't understand why aliens always attacked America, because most aliens would look at things like population density first. They don't understand trade flow. They wouldn't know our economy. They'd go, China and India have the largest mass of people on Earth. If we were to attack, you go for that first. So we then started with that and posited how it would work, how we would create what we call the messenger and messengers, what the first attack would look like, and then do our own take of the idea of kaiju plus Jaegers from South Asian mythology, which we called Shikari. And then we were both Evangelion Neon Genesis fans, which is an anime, a sci-fi anime that goes very heavy into things like emotions and PTSD. We posited, well, human soldiers are way too squishy to be driving mechs, pilot soldiers things. So we're like, we would have to upload them as AI because the human body is just way too fragile to be operating something like that. It's the weakest point. But then how would an AI develop PTSD? Because it's still a machine system. And if it's based off human emotions, it would have something. PTSD is chemical imbalances and it's human brain stress. AI can't have that. So we developed this idea of like this thing called desyncing, where the identity of the AI starts believing it's the God body that it's put into, and it starts developing multiple personality disorder and different executable programs and identities to cope with the fact that like it's falling apart. And we just ran from there and we hit it off. We have similar cultural backgrounds, even though he's Sri Lankan and I'm Indian. There's some shared mythology and evolution that we could both touch on. We're both familiar with parts of each other's mythology. The only difference was the time zone, but there is a time where both overlap. I believe around this time for me is around his night coming off of work. So we were able to get on chat, voice chat, talk things out, and we were just blitzing back and forth. He'd write 2,000 words. I go, oh, that's cool. And I have this idea to do this scene later. So if I do these 2,000 words now, do you think you'd be able to pick up from that and get to there? And he'd be like, yeah. And it was the easiest co-writing I've ever done in my life. I can't explain the process. It was just like as natural as breathing, working with him.
There is nothing when you find a writing partner with whom you click. There is nothing like it, and people who've not had that experience don't know just how joyous it
Mm-hmm.
totally is. Um, Messengers, and you touched on this a bit. Messengers and its follow-up, A Little Bit of Kali, draw heavily from South Asian mythology. How did that influence your work going forward? Because, prior to this time, we've talked about TV and Harry Dresden and urban fantasy, which is largely an American genre, though other countries have gone, hey, this is good, let's put it here. But you operated within the American view of it. So, how did working together um, and drawing on the South Asian mythology influence your work going forward?
A great deal, because I think prior to that, part of the reason I kept to the American side of things is obviously I was born here, diaspora writer, but growing up, I didn't see much of my own culture represented in media. I think I took it as a quiet sign that maybe just people didn't want it. Not many people obviously overtly would tell me that. That's just not the case, but there kind of is. Just by the success of other products, you don't see your own self and own culture represented. So you kind of think like, oh, maybe people just don't want that. But then the attention Messengers drew with the Nebula, and then a little bit of Kali being republished by Escape Pod with a wonderful audio adaptation showed me that like, okay, there is a market for this and people want to see this. And it gave me the freedom to do the first binding, which is heavily South Asian and Silk Road inspired. And these are myths I did grow up with, and I always wanted to see them represented. And which is why I started with urban fantasy, because even though it's very American centric, urban fantasy always felt like the natural playground for me to bring in myths from other cultures, because the Supernatural TV show was doing that even before I was writing. I think the show started, 2015, 2016, and they drew from mythology from all over the world and would showcase different monsters, pantheons of gods and creatures. And I thought urban fantasy would be the best place to start doing it. And when I saw that it would work in sci-fi, I've always naturally gravitated more to the fantastical side of things. I felt like, okay, I should do this fantasy, and it's been the best move I ever made. And it's also been really just naturally fulfilling for me to go deeper into mythology, which is a subject I love, but my culture's mythology, and be able to showcase that and redo it anew with the first binding.
Very cool. I always figure that, America is a good place, or the United States, Canada, are good places to bring in other mythologies, because even though we don't always admit it, we are a bunch of immigrants. We're all immigrants. And yeah, it is tragic not or and false not to recognize and celebrate that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always been fascinated by Indian mythology, but it is so vast
Yeah.
that don't and I wouldn't know where to begin. I want to read about it, but I wouldn't know where to begin as a writer to explore it. And so I think that's been part of the issue of not seeing it. You have to really know it to
Yeah.
do it justice. But going a little bit on a sideways. I want to get back to the whole fantasy thing. But you continue to do some sci-fi after Messengers. You've
Mm-hmm.
got a science fiction Star Shepherd. Do I
Yep.
have that right? Could you talk a little bit about that? And was this happening at the same time? Is it an outgrowth of your collaboration?
Believe it or not, it wasn't related to the collaboration at all. How that came about was my indie editor, who I love to this day and still recommend to everybody, Michelle Dunbar, had just started her own indie press. And she's like, hey, if you feel comfortable, I know things are going really well for you. I'd love a novel from you. But she's like, I only do sci-fi right now because it's a genre she loved more. She felt very naturally more apt to market that and produce that. And I've always had a love for language, whatever I do. Um, One thing I love, and I've always loved about the noir urban fantasy genre, is the tone of voice. There is such a thing as the noir tone of voice. When I wrote Lit RPG, there was a tone of voice for that. The first binding is very lyrically written. Star Shepherd came about as me just wanting to write like a love letter to the language of things like Cowboy Bebop and Firefly, more than anything. And I was like, this would be really fun to write a space western because I just love playing with language. I want to see these characters. I want to see these themes that are more popular in those genres. And then I want to help my friend. I want to give her this novel. I could care less how I did. I just really want to write a novel for her and with her because she's just that wonderful a person. And I started writing with just the opening scene, and it was like a bar scene. And it was very westerny, and a guy had a gun up against his waist. I think the opening line is, "No man could ever truly enjoy his drink with a gun at his side." And that's literally how it starts. Man's trying to drink his drink and someone puts a gun up on his side. And it just felt like the most space westerny thing ever. And it just naturally ran away. And it was absolutely fun. It was definitely more of a pulp novel, but I enjoyed every line of being able to write space western dialogue. It was just good fun.
Hmm. Yeah. You mentioned two of my favorite shows. I mean, Cowboy Bebop. It's just, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. I do love that. Do you, that said, you do find fantasy a bit more comfortable for you.
Yes. Urban fantasy, especially, which is obviously a subgenre of that. But I think growing up, um, and I had a hard life. We're not going to go into that here, but personally, I think I talked to you about that. But fantasy offered more of like the sense of wonder and fantastical, numinous stuff that I loved as escapism, which I think is why a lot of people turn to the genre. It's something Tolkien always spoke well of the genre. What it offers people a respite and an escape from the hard parts of reality, and that's not a bad thing. That is a very good thing, especially today as the world is still crazy. And I've just found fantasy to be more naturally calling to me. It's where I read the most and where I definitely feel happiest writing.
Okay, cool, cool. We've touched on the fact that you'd won a Dragon Award before you got into this, the Facebook group. You were, Messengers earned a Nebula nomination. You were nominated for another Dragon Award. Uh, what role have these awards and nominations played in your development as a published writer, which is kind of different from your artistic development, but
Right.
your career development as a writer?
The first year I got the Dragon Award nomination in 2016. Um, there was obviously the personal joy of it because it was with Jim Butcher. Was up there for the first Cinder Spires book, which again he told me years earlier that might happen to me. So I took it as a personal sign, like holy crap, I'm doing this. But the first Dragon Award, I believe, was covered by Verge in an article,
Mhm.
and the spotlight from that, just because how many people read the Verge, God, it was a millions. It instantly blew up my profile. My sales exploded, maybe 10 times overnight. I was earning a full-time living from 2 books. Because the spotlight the Verge brought onto the Grave Report as a product of that. And because of the association, obviously, to Dragon Con started inviting me to subsequent Dragon Cons as a guest or a attending professional, which blew up my profile in that I could start paneling with authors that I admired. Like I have paneled with Jim Butcher now several times. Patricia, I think my first panel ever was with Patricia Briggs, which was like mind blowing. And she's just the sweetest human being, but it was still like there are photos of me like geeking out. Like the panel hadn't started yet. We just sat up. Friends were at the 2017 Dragon Con because I've been nominated again for the Dragon Award there. They showed up to support me. My girlfriend at the time was there too. And they were all just taking photos of me sitting there, like my mouth hanging open, looking at Patricia Briggs. Like, oh my God, she's right there. It's just been great. It's led me to more networking, meeting more peers, getting me out in front of more fans, and being able to build a little bit more of a personal rapport with them, which has always been wonderful. And it's just led from one thing to another. The Nebulas obviously got me to the Nebula convention in 2019, which is where I met the agent who would become my agent later that year, Joshua Bilmish. That was fantastic to meet people there. I met a few other authors. The convention itself, beyond introducing me to my agent, I don't know what it did for my career, which is not to downplay it, but I've had very different experiences at industry-oriented conventions versus fan conventions. And maybe it's just my personality type. A lot of authors tend to be introverted, and I'm far more heavily extroverted. And the larger pop culture cons have rewarded that more. Your Dragon Cons, Salt Lake City, San Diego, whatever, the big ones. I naturally just bump into people left and right, and so many crazy things out of dreams happen there because I can just get along with anybody, and I could talk perfectly fine to anybody. And I kind of felt like an outsider at the smaller Nebula Con. It was very kind of hushed, quiet, small, little, private, little, tiny conversations. Everybody knew each other except for like me and my co-author Yuda that year. We barely knew anybody there. We kind of felt like strangers. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But hey, there are no wrong answers,
Yeah.
and everybody's experience is totally different. Um, we touched on this earlier, but let's go into it a little bit more detail. What inspired the turn, the shift to epic fantasy? You know, the big series is coming out this
Yeah.
August, the first binding. How did you get there from urban fantasy and sci-fi and kaiju?
I think it came as a response to the last book I wrote in Lit RPG, which was Beast Queen. It won't be the permanent last. I have a goal to finish every series I start. It's just life has been weird, financial circumstances up and down. The world's been crazy since the end of 2019 to now. But where Lit RPG was at the time, like I said, wasn't receptive to a lot of people taking different creative risks and writing something as dark as I did. And now the genre's broadened more up. But at the time, I felt that as a natural rejection to like, okay, the audience isn't here really for what I want to do, and I still want to get joy out of this. Maybe I should take a break. And I was reading a lot of literary works at the time. I was rereading King Killer Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. I was rereading classics like The Odyssey, Gilgamesh, including Robert Silverberg's take of Gilgamesh, which I think he just called I, Gilgamesh. And then, what is it? In the Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafron, which is one of the most lyrical novels I've ever read. It's beautiful. And I'd posted about like I'd love to write something like this, like a my own picaresque, following mythology I'm more comfortable with, and making it heavily lyrical, just something that people would even enjoy reading the sound of, like utterly beautiful. And a lot of people told me like I shouldn't do it, and this was a private Facebook post, that it might be too ambitious, too big, too out of the market. No one would want it. Agents wouldn't want it. And Jim Butcher actually showed up on that thread saying like, don't care about anybody else. If you really want to do it, your goal should be writing it to the best of your ability. Don't even worry about the genre classification. Don't worry about what publishers want. If you make it the best book you possibly can, it'll sell, and other people will figure out where to place it. And he was absolutely right. I chose it as an act of rebellion at the time against everyone who was like, don't do it, the market, whatever. I was like, okay, but it makes me happy. I'll do it. And I was absolutely uncompromising in it. It's a 350,000 word novel. It is massive. It's a non-linear frame narrative picaresque as well as a Bildungsroman. It's not very traditional. And that's been its biggest point of success. It sold instantly to an editor without having my agent first. And that was just off the sample. The first, I believe, 40,000 words were enough to sell the series. And then later, the following year, 2020, when I actually got the contract for it, it was enough to also get it sold internationally to Galanx in the UK. Mm-hmm. And the reception so far has been utterly just jaw-droppingly shocking. It's gotten nothing but like the most amazing positive reviews from largest reviewers, other authors, including my favorite, obviously, Jim was so kind to give the cover quote blurb for it, which was a dream come true. But yeah, I think it was more me just following my bliss as well as in the reaction to people telling me what not to do, as well as just not feeling quite at home with Lit RPG at the time where it was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You said 325,000 words. I'm 50. Still stuck on that. 350,000 words. What did they do? Is it going to be all in a doorstopper, or are they breaking it up?
Nope. It'll. I believe the UK might break it up. I don't know what their publication for the soft cover, the paperback, they will break it up. The US won't be, and I believe both hardcovers will still be just one volume. I believe it's 856 pages in hardcover. In mass market paperback, a smaller size, it's technically a 1,000-page book, I believe, based on what I know of word counts. But they were more than happy with it, and a lot of reviewers have absolutely loved it, including the pacing. Some of the nicest reviews have been very kind. and saying that it doesn't feel like it spins its wheels in any paces. It's perfectly placed. So
Was this the thing you were struggling with when in 2019-ish when I was trying to get in touch with you?
yes, this would be the work I started then. I actually started it at the end of 2018, but I didn't have much. I just had the concept and maybe the first few pages, and it was a side passion project. I was just tinkering on it here and there. Through 2019, I picked up a little bit more of it, especially around Dragon Con. But again, it was a passion project. And then I met my editor, who'd become my editor, Christopher Morgan, who was really fascinated by it. And I was like, okay. And I hammered a little bit more to it. And I made the end of the sample project, this nesting story inside the story. And I was like, that's a really good place to end a sample. It's just beautiful. It's lyrical. It sets the promise. And I sent that off to Tor. And I got an email a month and a half later. So this would be about November. He's like, hey, do you have time for a call in December? I need to talk to you. And I was like, okay. And he called and he was like, yeah, Tor wants to buy the series. Who's your agent? I'm like, I don't have one. And he was like, go pick one.
Well, that's frequently how it happens. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, I remember in 2020 we were trying to pull you into ConTinual, and you're going, no, no, no.
Yeah, I was on deadline the whole year, and I spent the entire year writing the other 350,000 words, as well as a bunch of other stuff. I wrote a novella to go to a submission to what is now Realm. They were Serial Box at the time.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
writing a bunch of short stories, false starts on other novels because my dog, 14 years, passed away
Oh,
spring
I'm
of
sorry.
2020. So I started an urban fantasy novel that I haven't finished as a love letter to my dog. So I was juggling so many projects. I think that year together, I wrote something in the neighborhood of 425,000
Oh my
words. It
God.
was, yeah, yeah. I was just working like a dog that year.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. No, I am so glad that it all worked out so
Thank you.
wonderfully. I mean, really. But I remember I'd write you say, "Hey, come on, pal."
Yeah, yeah. I had zero free time.
But this is the best possible reason to have you going
Yeah,
crazy and the best possible outcome. I am so thrilled about that.
thank you.
Can you tell our viewers a little bit about, we've alluded to it, but give us the jacket copy, version of the first binding at
Okay.
350,000 words.
So I've always, growing up the way I had, I've always been fascinated with the idea of rumors and truth because anybody, first of all, who's gone through high school has had something said about them that's true or untrue or twisted. And looking back at some of my favorite stories, they've all been like titular legends about a single person and both their deeds and misdeeds and how they get misconstrued throughout the world or blown up. And then obviously we've all probably seen the commercials that had their heyday, like in the 2010s upward of the most interesting man in the world who had all these ridiculous, hilarious claims. And I was like, I'd like to write a novel about that set in South Asian mythology and then use the Silk Road as a vehicle for his story being told across that. And the idea that no story can really keep its shape told so long across such a distance, what would that lead to? And it just started coalescing and coming from there, where I started developing Ari as, in the present day, he's a famous storyteller. And one of the biggest things he's done is lie about his own story because he's trying to hide now from the sins of his past. So he's parsed off his famous legends to other people. He's created a dozen fictional heroes and villains who've all done what he's really done. And then he meets a singer on the run, and sort of as both of them trying to get to know each other and trust each other, he's talking to her and she realizes who he really is out of legend. And he finds this one person he believes is genuinely willing to listen to the truth of his story and maybe not judge him for it. So he starts telling her all of it, and it's pretty much what you would expect. A life of legends, misdeeds, horrors, villainy, and then how they also got spun out of control. Sometimes something happens and someone else sees it, takes it a different way, and it makes him a hero. And it gets retold and retold and retold, and suddenly his deeds are larger than life. And sometimes he may have done larger than life things, but for the wrong reasons. And I want to get to the nuance of that. In many ways, it's closer to a literary fiction novel because it has a similar structure and it's very philosophical. It takes on the idea of villainy isn't ever clear cut, neither is heroism. A lot of things are down to being in the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time and how people interpret that and spread things. And yeah, the novel's just taken on a life of its own now at this point. It's a lead title from Tor. It's been getting insane, wonderful marketing and reviews. And I'm just trying to keep up with all its own momentum now at this point.
And it's going to be a series, huh?
Yes, it's sold for a series. Obviously, a lot of that's going to depend also on how well the first book does and renewal and blah 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 blah. But yeah,
Oh, cool, cool. You have come so far from the release of Gravesight in 2013. If you could give that earlier version of yourself or any aspiring writer one piece of advice, what would it be?
Um, it'd definitely be the advice that I've stuck to myself. It's gotten me here. It's don't give up and just keep trying, which sounds so trite and everybody hears it. But there have been so many times I was so close to doing it, and other friends too. And that was just the advice we trade back. And I never knew what the big break would be. I never foresaw the second book getting the Dragon Award nomination. I didn't know what it would lead to. And that gave me enough confidence to keep going just long enough to get the next one. And that gave enough confidence just to get to the next one, the next break, and trying different genres, which I didn't want to do at the time. I thought the key to success was just staying in that one genre, that one series. And maybe there is. The series has definitely gone through rises and falls, and it's been a long time since I put another book out in it. And I'm going to be writing book 4 pretty soon. But I think more importantly has just been sticking to the idea of writing itself, because you never know where your big break's going to come from. I've heard that from so many other authors. Jim Butcher's own story was like the Dresden Files was doing pretty good, but I don't think he was really making it full time until he had sold Codex of Alera in advance to his publisher. And that was about when he could go full time. And it was a whole new series he had to start to really get that going. And then, of course, the Dresden Files show happened, which blew up his profile and his income from there. And you can't predict all these things, but as long as you stay in the game long enough, your next break will come from somewhere. Because not only has the first binding done amazing things for me, and I believe it's going to keep on doing them, it's brought so much attention to my backlist already. The Grave Report sales have gone up. There have been people interested. During the time of the Nebula, there were people interested in doing an anime of the Grave Report. It didn't work out at the time, and I think the studio might have changed hands. I can't remember, but like that was really inspiring. And as long as I keep going, who's to say it can't ever happen again and this time work? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the advice I would say, to hold and believe, no matter how simple and even trite it sounds. Because we all hear it as a platitude, but it's also true.
Well, platitudes are that way because people have found them true. It's like cliches.
Yeah.
One just hopes the cliches aren't harmful. Okay. Yeah, we won't go there. That's another conversation entirely. What are you working on now?
I'm literally finishing up book 2 of Tales of Tremaine. It's on deadline, and I believe I have a few more weeks for it. And I'm perfectly on pace for it. It'll be a little tight, but where I'm at the novel now is pretty much done. I'm just doing edits, small rewrites myself before giving it to my editors. I'm still on what some would consider the rough draft for me. Technically, it's my first official working draft. The story's done. I'm just punching up certain things and themes and scenes and symbolisms and just being a little, OCD over it. And then I'll go to my editors, and then they'll go over it and do their first pass.
Magic.
Yep. And then I would like to say I'll be on vacation, but I will be at Denver Comic Con in like 2 weeks, and then I'll come back and I'll be at a lake house vacation where I'll be starting the 4th Grave Report novel. And then I fly out for San Diego Comic Con to promote the first binding, and then I come back, and then I get ready to go to New Orleans for a book launch tour for the first binding. Then I come back, and then I do a book launch tour here in Virginia, and then I go straight to Dragon Con. So I'm just going to be working for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, hey, this is how you build a career, right?
Yeah.
And this is what you've wanted since you were 18. So
yeah,
ride that wave. Okay. Anything, we're coming up against the end of the interview. Is there anything you'd like to add? Soapbox is provided free of charge.
Definitely check out my co-writer Jaya Wijaratne's work. He released a novel a little while ago called Salvage Crew, which was actually voiced by Nathan Fillion. So for everyone who likes Firefly, he's the audio narrator. Fantastically well received. It debuted, I believe, on the Washington Post bestseller list, or it hit it. He absolutely deserves all the love he can, because for those who don't know, right now Sri Lanka is going through a lot of craziness. Their government's in a really bad spot, kind of falling apart, and most people right now only have power for 3 hours a day. And he actually started a news company called Watchdog to help combat things like fake news. So he's kind of shifted gears, and his noveling career is kind of like on hiatus. So I just thought it'd be really nice if people could go pay attention to some of the work she's already done.
Okay, I agree with you, and therefore I'm going to ask you to do something rather unusual. Could you spell out his name, and if there is a place where people can find him on the web? beyond
Yeah.
buying Salvage Crew?
Oh yeah. So Yudhanjaya is Yudhanjay. Last name Wijaratane. Wijeratne. I believe you just put in his name, his wiki will come up, but also his blog website, which is called Icarus Wept, where he has a lot of updates. He's active on all social media. You can find him on Twitter by just putting in that same name. Obviously, his books are available everywhere, but I believe his blog would probably be the best place to catch up with him and understand him, or his Twitter, where he is most active, posting stuff about not his career as much anymore, but just a lot of news journalism stuff for people who are interested in that.
Yeah, he does a lot of data analysis too,
Yes.
as part of his fight to combat fake news.
Yeah.
So yes, and so why don't you also give us where we can find you on the web?
Oh yeah. My Facebook author page would just be Facebook/r Virdi. I'm most active on Twitter, and it's really simple. It's just at r Virdi. I for social media, Twitter's the best place. I don't really use my website, I'll be honest. Starting indie, a lot of authors have used their website just as a placeholder. Like, we have it, there's some facts about us, but as an extrovert, I'm definitely easier to get a hold of to just talk directly to. I absolutely have no problem tweeting people back and forth. I enjoy Twitter as how easy it is functionality wise. I could always just pop up my phone and reply to people. I do have a YouTube, also just R Virdi. And my books are available literally everywhere. If you put it in just my name, you'll find a place to buy it. I'm not picky. I don't care where you buy me from.
That's wonderful. Yeah, sales are sales are
Yeah.
sales. As long as the
Yep.
money flows to the author, it's all good.
Yep.
So anyway, thank you so much,
Thanks
Ronnie.
for having
And
me.
oh, my pleasure. And thank you from ConTinual, the convention that's always here for you.